Hi everybody, it's meteorologist Joe Cioffi on this Friday, what's been an absolutely spectacular week of weather, at least where I am in the northeastern part of the United States, and specifically in the New York City, New Jersey, Long Island, Connecticut, Hudson Valley, eastern Pennsylvania area. You can probably add 150 or 200 miles or more in all directions for this, but we've had virtually cloud-free conditions here for 4 days, and that just doesn't happen here very often. And I think this has really been probably the best week of weather that we have seen here all year long, and that's going to continue through the weekend. But there are changes underway in the upper air pattern, and we've been talking about this over the last several days, that we are going to see a pattern change. But I want to caution everybody by what I mean with regards to pattern change. The last almost, let's say, 6 to 7 weeks, we've been dominated by this ridge in the east, trough in the west scenario of varying degrees. Sometimes it's been very strong, other times it hasn't been all that strong, but overall that has been the pattern. We are going to go to something different. I think something more active, something that's going to cause temperature swings to occur every couple of days. It doesn't mean that it can't warm up in between weather systems. In fact, it will probably do that. If you think that this is going to be a pattern switch to wintertime weather, because I know a lot of you are wintertime weather fans, there might be moments of that going forward, but in terms of consistency, that's something that remains to be seen. And let's remember where we are in the calendar. We're at the end of October, not at the end of December. So there's still a lot of room here for temperatures to be up into the 60s and 70s in some places. Will we see it for 7, 8, 9 days in a row? No, that I think we're done with that. But the other upside is that we will be getting some much needed rainfall, because that has been really totally lacking in a lot of areas. Meanwhile, we've got a lot of action going on in the west. Santa Ana winds in California, so temperatures will be headed up there to summer heat wave levels. Very heavy rains up in the Pacific Northwest. And it looks like we might have some snow next week in the northern and central Rockies. So stand by, and we'll give you the latest weather analysis, and we'll come back and address your questions in just a little bit. Take a look at our weather on this Friday, as conditions in the east remain about the same, but we're starting to see some subtle changes on the satellite view in terms of the overall weather pattern, because there is going to be a pattern change or a pattern shift. Now, those of you who are absolutely enamored with wintertime weather, if you think this is going to suddenly turn things really cold, think again. Pattern changes are usually processes. They're not single events that create extremes and keep it that way. We are going to start to see a stair-step decline over the next week or two. The ridge in the east is what's been dominating, and you can see how bone dry it remains. In fact, it was so bone dry in my particular area, which is the New York, New Jersey, this area right in here, Long Island, Connecticut, eastern Pennsylvania, was so bone dry today that we actually had risk for brush fires, and we wound up having a couple of very small ones that broke out in a few places. But this is the extent of the dryness that is in the east. We've hardly had any rain in the last 2 months, except for an odd event here and an odd event there. Certainly we haven't seen anything widespread. But we're starting to see some moisture finally come back out of the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see it running up into Louisiana and Arkansas. There's a storm that's out in the Atlantic Ocean that's moving away to the northeast. It's kind of pushed that frontal boundary out further to the southeast. But all of this part of the process. And out in the corner of the picture, in the upper left corner, you can see clouds moving into the northern Rockies, and that's with regards to the action that is going on in the west. And that's where it has been very, very busy. You can see this fire hose jet here of the clouds coming into the Pacific Northwest. That's been constant, and we had one weather system that moved in. We have another one that's coming in for later in the weekend. All of this also is setting up the Santa Ana wind into California, and it's going to be very hot across much of Southern California over the coming days. They may start the World Series with temperatures around 100 degrees, the way the weather outlook is shaping up. So we're going to look at first the western part of the U.S., because that's where we do have some action this evening. You can see on the GFS showing snows across the northern Rockies, rain along the Pacific Northwest coast. So that's that first weather system that's moved in. A second one comes in tomorrow morning with some heavy rains and some snows up in the mountains, especially tomorrow night in Washington State. Some very heavy rains being indicated, lasting into Sunday morning, and that area kind of dies out. And then going into Tuesday, much of the west is dry. So at this point, you're getting that pattern change that's going to affect the east. And here's that Santa Ana wind. You can see all these easterly isobars here coming into California. So this is going to mean for some very hot weather again in that area. And up in the northwest, things are going to dry out. Now, I'm going to come back to the longer range with this in just a second. I want to now go to the eastern part of the United States, and we'll take a look at what's going to be happening in the short range. So here's that big high. Actually, the high reformed over the central Appalachians, and it's brought down that dry air to the north. That high goes out, and then we're going to start to see that moisture building across the middle Mississippi Valley. Might be an outbreak of some severe weather here across the lower middle Mississippi Valley along about Saturday night into Sunday. Then as we move into Monday and Tuesday, this is where we start to get the moisture to come into the east. We've been almost cloud-free for so many days, and that's going to probably change on Monday, but the weekend's fine. You'll notice low pressure developing in Alabama. There's a weather front here, so now as we move on into Tuesday, we're going to see a series of these systems like this, where you're going to have these, cold fronts with a wave developing on it, and then here you've got some colder air that's coming down. It's the first shot, so it's not all that cold to start off with, but it is going to be certainly colder. And one of the things with regards to this change in the pattern that we're having is the fact that we are going to start to see weather systems with some regularity come into the eastern part of the United States, as long as we don't have any kind of big ridge building in the east. That is the big change here. Now, we'll give you the wider view, and I'll show you what the upper air looks like through all of this. And I'm going to go back one run because we'll have more to look at. Let me just start you off with tonight. There it is, folks. Signature pattern has been the case for much of the last month and a half. Ridge in the east, troughing in the west. This fire hose Pacific jet just running right across the Pacific into the west coast. And that has been it. And every time the ridge flattens, however temporarily, it pops right back up. Well, that's changing. So what you have with the ridge breaking down, now there's changes going on all over the place. I mean, you've got a change in the profile of the upper air systems back in Alaska and in the Gulf of Alaska. You'll notice going into Monday, we have a very deep trough that forms right along, I believe that's 160 west. Yeah, 160 west all the way down. That allows this ridge to build. Now, whenever there's one extreme in one spot, there has to be a counteracting extreme in the other direction. And you have deep trough, strong ridge, deep trough, strong ridge. So you see how it works? And when these troughs are not that deep, the ridges are not that strong. I mean, this is just kind of like this yo-yo, this seesaw back and forth that happens with the upper air pattern, throughout days and weeks and months at a time. But at this point, we're going from this sort of ridge east, trough west, and not much else. But now we're going into this much more high amplitude pattern where you have strong ridges and deep troughs. And that's going to mean for a lot of swings and a lot of changes. Now, notice the GFS has two systems here to look at. Here's the one in the east. There's another one that's dropping down out of Canada. Okay, that kicks along the first one. And then as that first one lifts up and out, the second one dives in. Now, in between that, you're probably going to get a brief warm-up, but you don't have this ridge that's locked up in the east. Notice, again, the extremes here. Very deep trough that runs from north-central Canada all the way down into South Texas. Strong ridge that builds back up off the Pacific Northwest coast up into Alaska. Strong Atlantic ridge that builds up through the Atlantic on over toward Greenland. There's a couple of other little weather systems in the mix that make things a little more complicated from the day-to-day forecast standpoint. But again, you can see all this amplitude. And by the way, not to leave Western Europe out, you do have a deep trough, deep upper low and trough that's way out in the Eastern Atlantic, and that'll have implications on the weather in Europe. So going forward, that second trough then does its thing and lifts up. And you still have, going into the long range, there's some semblance of a vortex in southern Canada that develops. So then yet a third trough late in the forecast period is being indicated. Now, of course, this is deep in the long range. We'll see what happens when we get there. But it seems that the signature pattern of ridge in the east, trough in the west is gone, at least for now. And as each one of these troughs develops in the east and plays itself out, you're going to wind up seeing colder and colder air masses as a result. Now, I would not focus on the specifics here because, of course, we know they're going to change. But here's the full U.S. view, that front into the east, and that moves on by. Now, in terms of rainfall, why don't we take a look? I'm going to stop here for a second. Let's look at rainfall across the United States. We'll look at accumulated rainfall here for the next 5 days or so. And you'll notice the big amounts in western Washington, 4 and 6 inch plus amounts there, and in through westernmost Oregon, but it cuts off sharply into northern California. Here in the east, looks like a broader area of 2 inch plus rains along and west of the Appalachians, which would make sense, half an inch to an inch along the coastal plain. And as we go through next week and into the following weekend with the second trough, notice the west. Not much happens in the west, but more in the east. We start to get additional amounts of rain that come into the east, particularly on the second trough, more along the coast than in inland spots. And the west stays quiet because they're going to be in a ridge position. So just a very, typical of this time of year. We're about to flip out of the usual September-October dryness, which has been a bit on the extreme side this time around. We're going to flip away from that and go to something a little bit more active. Certainly, actually more than a little bit more active. So let me just back you up on the U.S. map again, and then I'm going to show you what's going on over in Europe. But here's our system for Tuesday. Hooray, hooray, it rains. Notice, by the way, in the Rockies, a system that drops down with that second trough produces snows in the northern and central Rockies. Could be some more snow for Colorado if this is right later next week with that cold shot. And then that low swings out to the Great Lakes with a cold front and produces the season's first snows. If this is, again, correct in terms of the structure of the trough, we're going to have to watch this. And then that front moves through the Northeast next weekend with another low dropping behind it. And also notice through time, each shot gets a little colder. Each swing of that trough brings down a colder and colder air mass. I think that's really the big takeaway in all of this as we move on forward. There's nothing here that I could specifically point to as far as things happening. Please don't use the GFS as a literal interpretation in the long range. That'll only get you into trouble because it just, the longer we go out in time, the more squirrely these models are. Okay, so the GFS now for what's going on in Europe. We have another storm. The UK Met, the United Kingdom Meteorological Service, they named storms there, and this is Storm Brian that is going to be moving over Ireland overnight and on Saturday. And there will be some winds of 40 to 50 knots with this, and then across England and out from there it begins to dissipate. Some snows up into the Alps, so there's a little bit of action there. And overall, you know, I'm trying to get a flavor for how things work out here in the North Atlantic, because it can be a bit crazy with all these Atlantic storms. But there are several of them that are going to be running around over the next couple of weeks. But on the whole, the weather doesn't look too crazy once we get through with Storm Brian. And you'll start to see, by the way, increasing snow in the western areas of Siberia and over into parts of Eastern Europe as we move into the first part of the month of November. So pretty interesting weather all the way around. It's always fascinating to see how this is all linked together. But here's one last look of the weather in the east. Here's one last look of the weather in the west. Stand by, and I'll be with you momentarily. All right, I'm back, folks. A couple of notes. Anthony Orr brings up the fact that a typhoon recurving in November caused the big cold shot November of 2014. That is correct. And we do have typhoon land that's going to be moving over Japan, parts of Japan, that's going to recurve eventually out to the northeast. That actually is going to energize everything that's going to be going on up in near Alaska with that deep trough that develops and ultimately cascades down with the change in pattern here in the eastern part of the United States. So that does happen from time to time. And if I remember, also in 2015, in mid-January, a recurving typhoon set the ball rolling with regards to the very cold air that came in from mid-January all the way to the end of March. So these things do have impact down the road and need to be paid attention to. So that is going to be something. Maybe tomorrow, if I got to remember two things. Maybe I got to remember that. Maybe we'll touch upon that more tomorrow. And also the fact that now that we're getting into late October, I have to remember to show you the snowfall maps because it is going to become more and more relevant to our day-to-day analysis. And PlayStation boss, yeah, the switch from 70s to much colder happens a lot. You know, sometimes you get these extremes like this. It does happen. Carso Bayando, am I leaning more toward the GFS or European? Both models are doing pretty much the same thing. I mean, in terms of the specifics, there are differences, but you know, for specific locations from the day-to-day forecast. But in terms of the overall flavor of the pattern, I think both models are doing pretty much the same thing here. And yes, Seth, so basically the pattern fold is slowly being turned on the cool side. In stair-step fashion, that's correct. It's going to be a process in stair-step fashion. Each one of those fronts will make it a little colder. And again, let's remember where we are. We're at the end of October. We're not at the end of December. So, you know, if we have to go from high temperatures in the 70s to high temperatures in the 60s or even the 50s, that's colder. Okay, that's what I'm getting at here, because you know, I've already seen comments about, you know, misinterpreting things. And you know, when I speak about pattern change, it's always, you know, from the meteorological perspective. That's what it is. You may not get the pattern change you want or the pattern change you wish for. And also notice, by the way, you know, model's tendency to forecast blocking patterns that most of the time do not occur. So we have to be very careful when we start to see these long-range patterns with regards to blocking. I joke around the fact that you know, I use the line that weather models have shown 20 out of the last 2 blocking patterns because that's what they do. They start showing them, and then when you get to reality, it winds up being something else. So we are going to just keep a focus on what's happening both on the Atlantic side and the Pacific side, because of, again, this high amplitude nature of the pattern that we're going to be going into. High amplitude can lead to a lot of interesting weather phenomena, and you will get some instances where things will be where the rubber band is going to be stretched a bit to the extreme in one place or another. So just bear that in mind. It's nice to see there's a lot of folks on. I guess everybody's getting ready for the weekend. Telling Dark Forest looking for some relief in Florida. Well, yeah, this is tough with you in that ridge position there, but you at least had some rain out of this over the last few days. But you got to get that deep trough. We get those high amplitude deep troughs like that. You can push cold fronts pretty far to the south. So we might get we'll probably see one of these weather fronts, the next couple of weather fronts, make it pretty, at least into northern Florida. Whether it makes it all the way down to South Florida might be another matter, but it certainly should make it into northern Florida. Yeah, let me just explain, by the way, because Eric P. brought up this question, and I'm going to be doing this going forward, unless there's some really crazy weather. If there's some crazy storm going on someplace that requires me to do everything in that Brady Bunch format that I was doing with the hurricanes, I will do that. But I find it when we go into the late fall, winter, and early spring months, that there's a lot going on in the upper atmosphere, and I want to be able to draw on the maps and kind of illustrate for you what actually is happening. So what I will do is what I've been doing the last number of live streams, which is right before I go on, I pre-record that weather portion that you saw. This way we can watch, you can watch that, I can talk with you guys on the chat at the same time and interact as best I can. And then we'll come back and we do this live conversation. I think that really works pretty well. You'll get to see the models. You'll get to see, when I show you a trough and I draw on it, and you're not quite understanding what it is. It allows me the opportunity to illustrate it for you a bit better, and it also allows me to focus, because I know what I want to talk about, and I'm not doing everything on the fly, which sometimes can be a bit disruptive. Have I read up Michael Joe Renkin and the Bering Sea rule? I guess I got to Google that. I'm not really familiar with that. I kind of have a guess at what it might be, but let me look it up before I answer. Weather and low 78. You're always you're going through the same questions all the time, and you really kind of need to back off a little bit. Okay. Carso wants the lake effect machine to kick in. Well, it will eventually. I bet you one of these troughs that swings eastward as we go into November, we will get to see. We'll see that first real kick in of the lake effect machine. I would really love to be able to go up there and see it in action, and maybe I can figure out a way to do that. I'm gonna plot and scheme a little bit. Kevin Francis, do I ever think about a meet and greet? You know what? It has crossed my mind. I'm going to try and actually set something up somewhere maybe over the next couple of months. I do have library appearances on Long Island coming up on Wednesday, November 8th, and Sunday, November 12th. I'll be at the Middle Country Library in Selden, New York, on the 8th. That's at 7 o'clock. That's a Wednesday night. And then I will be at the North Babylon Library on Sunday the 12th, and I believe that's at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So you got a weeknight if that works for you if you're on Long Island, and you've got a Sunday that might work for not just folks on Long Island, but maybe if you have to travel from elsewhere. But yeah, maybe I may set up and do some sort of meet and greet in the coming months, and I got to figure out how to do it, and I'll let you know. Anish Patel, how many ice storms occur in Virginia? Well, you do get them from time to time. I don't think the last few winters you haven't seen very much of it because of the way the upper pattern has been. But some years it can get pretty active. So we'll have to just we're just going to have to wait and see when we get there. I think it's really important. The next 4 to 5 weeks, I think, are going to be very important in terms of getting a sense for where we may be going for this coming winter. So we're going to pay. This is a good time for everybody to pay close attention to the overall pattern developing. It doesn't necessarily mean that the signature of the winter will be written in the next 4 to 6 weeks, but we might get a sense of where troughs and ridges are going to want to set up. We may get a sense of how much cold air wants to come down and how far south the cold air gets. Granted, deeper in the winter, those cold air masses are going to get further south for sure, but you can sometimes get a good feeling for where the early part of the winter at least is going to go by watching the evolution of the next several weeks. So we're going to be paying attention to all of that. All right, folks. Hope you had a great Friday, and I hope you're going to have a very good Friday evening. We will be back tomorrow. Probably, I'm going to try and maybe push it. May have to push it back closer to 7 or 8 o'clock, but just check on the channel. I'll schedule the live stream earlier in the day, so you'll have an idea of what time I'll be doing it. And the same holds for Sunday as well. And I hope everybody has a great weekend. It's going to be very interesting to see how these weather models handle things over the next coming weeks. And we'll be taking that journey with all of you that are on here. And thank you so much for being all of you regulars that come on a daily basis. Thank you for those of you who've hit my super chat. I appreciate that as well. It gets me a cup of coffee and a cigar. And for those of you who have tossed some coin into my PayPal account, I appreciate that also very much. All right, so everybody have a great Friday night and a great weekend. We'll see you tomorrow. Enjoy.